Hello, this is Tony Heller from RealClimateScience.com, setting the record straight about climate. In this video, I'm going to tell you the remarkable story of the state animal of Victoria. First, I'm going to show you the story of the fairy possum as presented by the Only Melbourne website. And after that, I'm going to show you the real story and how the possum was saved by massive bushfires in 1939. This is what Only Melbourne has to say. Leadbeater's possum is an endangered marsupial that can be found in the Central Highlands of Victoria. Prior to 1961, this animal was thought to be extinct. Then they spell the name of the possum wrong and say it's the official faunal emblem of Victoria State. The current decline of the species is due to a diminishing habitat caused by timber harvesting and fires. Now we're going to look at the real story, which was written up in Melbourne's newspaper The Age in September 1990. I'm going to read the whole article because the details are fairly important. The column on Leadbeater's possum 2 weeks ago stirred the possum in the Department of Conservation and Environment. The department disputes the conclusion that Victoria's faunal emblem could become extinct in the wild during the next 50 years, but says natural factors, not logging, pose the primary threat. The problem, according to Dr. Robert Warnicki, began with the prolific regrowth of mountain ash forests in the central Victorian highlands after the massive bushfires of Black Friday 1939. The possum was presumed to be extinct early in the 20th century, but it apparently hung on in inaccessible areas of forest. The 1939 fires removed the old forest, leaving thousands of dead trees sitting amid vigorous young regrowth. Half a century later, the regrowth forests have become prime habitat for the possum, which nests in hollow trees but feeds on nectar and the insects that colonize young mountain ash and acacias. Dr. Warnicki says the dead trees are now collapsing, leaving the possums without nest hollows. Dr. David Lindenmayer, the zoologist whose article in the science journal Search drew attention to this loss of habitat, also agrees that the primary threat is not the logging of the regrowth forest, but the natural decay and collapse of the possum's lofty apartments. The 1939 fires were so extensive that most of the mountain ash forest in the Central Highlands today is of uniform age and undergoing vigorous growth towards maturity a century hence. At that time, some of the 1939 trees will begin to develop hollows, creating potential new homes for the possum, provided there is adjacent young forest in which it can forage. In the intervening period, the possum will find itself stranded. The old nest trees will disappear and will not be replaced for a century. The challenge for conservation managers is to nurse the species through this trough, when its population will crash with or without logging. The irony is that for the present, the possum's numbers may never have been higher. As a post-fire opportunist, it seems to have bred prolifically in recent decades as the 1939 regrowth improved its habitat. But in the immediate period after the fires, it would have found the going tough, since the tree crickets that provide so much of its protein are slow to colonize regrowth ash forests and do not become abundant for at least a decade. The key takeaways from this article is that the fairy possum was rescued by the massive 1939 fires, and that the possum needs regular intervals of fire in order to maintain its population. The possum is not threatened by logging or fire. What it's threatened by is the lack of fire. Human intervention to subdue fires is wiping out the possum's habitat. The possums are, as the article stated, a post-fire opportunist species. Now let's take a look at the massive fires which rescued the possum on this date in 1939. This is the January 14, 1939 front page of the Courier Mail in Brisbane. Fire death roll 28, 4 children trapped. Town's 3,000 people flee from flames. 100 homes burn in Melbourne suburb. 24 more die in record heatwave. Melbourne 114 degrees. Here's the front page of the Herald. Hundreds flee from sweeping bushfire peril. Towns ringed by flames and record heat. 600 take refuge in river as wind drives blaze on. Township of Erica reported to be doomed. Melbourne breaks all-time heat record, 114 degrees. And this is from Adelaide. All heat records go. 116.9 beats 1858 maximum. 5th day of heat wave. Victorian fires now more menacing. Towns evacuated as flames close in. Many homes burnt. Day of terror. And there's one more very interesting item on this page. It says that on the night of January 26, 1858, the temperature in Adelaide never dropped below 95.1 degrees. The low temperature that night in 1858 was 35 degrees Celsius, and that was with CO2 levels well below 300 parts per million. The 1939 fires went on for weeks. This is the Sydney Morning Herald, Wednesday, February 1st, 1939. Motorists on the Great Ocean Road were fortunate to escape when fierce flames on Monday swept over the highway. A party fled to the sea through sparks and flames when their caravan was destroyed on the road. January 11th, 1939 was the hottest day on record in Adelaide, Melbourne, and Canberra. Climate alarmists like to say that the heat of the 1930s was caused by bad farming practices in the Oklahoma Panhandle, but I suspect they didn't have a whole lot of effect on Southeast Australia. The bushfires of January 1939 were massive. Joe Nova dug up this map. The map shows the 1939 burn areas in orange. Now we're going to compare the fires of 1939 with those from this year. This is a satellite photo of the worst day of the fires this year. And this animation overlays the 1939 fire map on top of the 2019 satellite image. As you can see, the 1939 fires were much more extensive than this year's fires. You can also see that the 1939 fires burned in much closer to Melbourne than this year's did. These stories about all of Australia being on fire this year were just more of the usual climate alarmist propaganda. After the 1939 fires, there was a commission set up to study them. The commission concluded that the fires, like this year, were lit by the hand of man. On Friday the 13th of January, known as Black Friday, it appeared that the whole state of Victoria was on fire. The commission also concluded that the amount of controlled burning prior to the fire was ridiculously inadequate, just like this year. The heat in Southeast Australia was much greater in 1939 than it has been this summer. Temperatures got as high as 121 degrees and birds were dropping dead from the trees. The temperatures on January 10, 1939 were pretty incredible. 48 degrees at Burke, 46 degrees at Adelaide, 47 degrees at Mildura. And it was 42 degrees out in West Australia. January 10, 1939 may have been the hottest day on record in Australia, but there's not enough information from the interior to make that determination. It was also reported that temperatures at Tea Tree Well went for days without getting below 130 degrees Fahrenheit. After the 1939 fires, koalas faced extinction. There were about 600 left of them in Victoria and even fewer in New South Wales. The heat and fire of 1939 was worse than this year, but the big difference was the level of propaganda, which was much larger in 2019 and 2020. It was also reported in 1939 that the glaciers in eastern Greenland were rapidly melting, and that the glaciers of Greenland, like those in Norway, faced the possibility of a catastrophic collapse. In 1939, scientists confirmed the fact that the Arctic regions around Spitsbergen were warming up at the rate of approximately 1 degree every 2 years. Since 1910, when observations first started in those regions, the cumulative rise of winter temperatures amounted to nearly 16 degrees. Every complaint that climate alarmists are making about the current weather also occurred in 1939. And like in 1939, people imagine that the climate is changing. This myth arises over and over again. The fairy possum was nearly extinct but was rescued by the 1939 fires, and by 1990 may have been at an all-time population peak. These possums depend on habitat created by fire. When man prevents fires from occurring, what they're doing is they're wiping out the possums. It's unfortunate that climate alarmists rely on propaganda rather than science. Visit Toto on the web at realclimatescience.com. He's been pulling back the curtain on junk science and propaganda for a long time.